We've told of the feud between the Hatfields and the McCoys, probably the most well-known historical event in the Appalachian region, and one that has painted the public's view of Appalachia and its people for good or bad for over a century. Today we tell of Devil Anse Hatfield's second son, William Anderson Hatfield Jr., or Cap as he's known, and his flight to freedom around the turn of the 20th century. Hello folks, I'm Steve Gilley, along with Rod Mullins, and this is Stories, a History of Appalachia. And I'd love it if you'd just go down below and click that subscribe button if you haven't subscribed already, and ding the bell so you get notified every time we have a new story coming out. And if you don't care, give us a thumbs up, okay?
Now, just when you think, though, Steve, that we have gotten past the Hatfields and McCoys, there's more stories about the Hatfields. This is just unreal, and I never knew this story because everybody has always touched on the Hatfield and McCoy feud, but this is interesting.
Well, I'm telling you, this whole clan is just interwoven into Eastern Kentucky and West Virginia history in a way that nobody else is at any other time. For good or for bad. And there are a lot of little intricacies with this story that we may or may not, catch, but we're going to try to tell you as much of it as we can, as closely as we can. A lot of this came from newspaper articles and from some stories that have been written about Cap Hatfield. And if you aren't familiar with who Cap Hatfield is, go back and check your Hatfield and McCoy history. He was probably the most intense of the Hatfield boys. He was involved very closely with what happened at the McCoy cabin when it was burned down and they shot several of the McCoy children and all that. There was a lot of blood on his hands, let's put it that way. But in the end, there's a twist because he turned his life around and did something you might find surprising.
I'm trying to remember, and of course, they had the Hatfield and McCoy miniseries, if you want to call it that, on History Channel with Kevin Costner. But I'm trying to remember who played that role. But they, it was the part that they showed about the burning of the house, the shooting, and it was pretty intense. Yeah, pretty intense what they showed on TV. That just, of course, in a recreation.
Yeah. Well, Devil Anse Hatfield was known as captain during and after the Civil War, and his son, William Anderson Hatfield Jr., became known as the Little Captain after his daddy. Now, that nickname was soon shortened to Cap, and that's what he was known as for the rest of his life. As I mentioned a minute ago, he was heavily involved in that infamous feud between the Hatfields and the McCoys in eastern Kentucky and southwestern West Virginia along the Tug River border between the two states. He, in fact, was probably the most involved in the feud, gaining a reputation for violence during that time.
Well, as time passed, the feud itself died down and life moved on. In 1895, Cap and his wife Nan, along with their children, moved from the Hatfield home place at Island Creek to the newly formed Mingo County, West Virginia, and the town of Matewan, which I'm sure you've heard us talk about before on here, but it was, of course, later famous for that part in the West Virginia mine wars of the early 20th century. Well, one reason Cap moved to Matewan was to represent his father's timber business in that area, which included 5,000 acres of forest that Devil Anse owned across the Tug from Matewan in Kentucky along Main Island Creek. Now, a new sawmill had been built there on Mate Creek near Matewan, and that sawmill would need trees to cut up lumber, and Cap Hatfield wanted to supply that lumber on behalf of his father. But that old feud, though, was still alive in that part of the country.
Yes, it was, and there was still reward money out of Kentucky for the capture of Devil Anse, Johnsey, and Cap, along with others associated with the Hatfield family. Because of this, Cap Hatfield was always on guard lest somebody catch up with him and take him across the river to collect some money. Still, he and his kin were held in awe by most of the townsfolk in Matewan and the surrounding area. There was another in Matewan who had a reputation, though, almost as notorious as Cap Hatfield. John Rutherford was the son of a prominent local doctor Elliot, Doc Rutherford, a one-time close friend of Devil Anse, and the namesake of one of his sons. That was before Doc Rutherford's run-in with John Chafin. Now, you see, John Chafin was the cousin of Levice Hatfield, Devil Anse's wife and Cap's mother. In a violent encounter between the two, the doctor shot Chafin, leaving a slug in his spine, crippling him for life. In return, according to Doc's son John, Cap had shot up his house, a claim denied by the Hatfield family. This led to a dramatic split between the Rutherfords and the Hatfields. John Rutherford grew up to become known as the Bully of Matewan, running roughshod over the town, and he was intent, Rod, on settling scores with Cap Hatfield.
Well, 1896 was an election year in West Virginia, and John Rutherford was a die-hard Democrat. That fall, Rutherford told a group of Democratic Party volunteers at a saloon over in Pike County, Kentucky, that Cap Hatfield was trying to persuade folks to vote for those damn Republicans. He reportedly said,
"If Cap comes to Matewan and votes the Republican ticket, let's put him over in Kentucky."
Meaning, turn him in for the bounty on his head. Well, ironically, or, well, maybe not, days after those comments were made, somebody did shoot up John Rutherford's house.
On Election Day, November 3rd, 1896, Cap Hatfield arrived at the polling place in Matewan ready to vote a straight Republican ticket. What he found was the usual Appalachian party that was Election Day throughout the mountains at that time, and which ironically had spelled trouble for many a Hatfield in elections past. Cap came to the voting booth with his stepson, Joe Glenn, who was carrying his double-barrel shotgun given to him by his stepfather, and I think Joe was maybe 16 or 17 at this time. Well, not long after casting his vote, Cap, Joe, and one of Cap's friends were on their way to get some supper when John Rutherford stepped out of his father's store. Rutherford shouted at Cap to look here. When Cap did, John fired a shotgun twice, clipping Cap Hatfield's ear and nicking him on the neck, drawing blood. Cap pulled his gun and shot Rutherford just as Rutherford pulled a pistol and began to fire again. There was total bedlam.
Suddenly, in the melee, a shotgun blast hit an election official who had been egging Rutherford on in the gun battle, a man named Henderson Chambers. Chambers fell to the ground, dead. Cap, who had been firing his Winchester rifle, swapped guns with Joe. As they did so, a bullet hit the shotgun barrel, shattering and spraying Cap's hand with lead, causing him to begin to bleed badly. With that, Joe Glenn got his stepfather and took off out of town with him, the Rutherfords in hot pursuit. They made it to a railroad trestle, atop of which was Dr. Elliot Rutherford, who rained bullets down on Cap Hatfield, huddled among the bridge timbers below. Joe Glenn darted ahead up Meat Creek, drawing fire and allowing Cap to escape. As he did so, he aimed the shotgun at one of the men on the bridge, shooting him in the foot and severing 3 of his toes.
Well, Rutherford continued to fire until Cap caught up with Joe, took back his Winchester, carefully aimed, and shot Elliot Rutherford through the heart, killing him, his lifeless body falling from the trestle. Well, after waiting for hours, Cap Hatfield and Joe Glenn took off for Cap's friend's Dan Christian's place. They hid out there for several days to avoid the posse searching high and low for him. Well, that posse had even gone to Main Island Creek and questioned Devil Anse himself as to Cap's whereabouts. They eventually gave up and headed on back to Matewan. Well, a few days later, Dan Christian took Cap and Joe up where they could find the railroad tracks and a watering stop. There they waited till an N&W train stopped for water around midnight. They climbed aboard and hid in the baggage car. They rode that train 100 miles up to Huntington, West Virginia. There, Cap went to the county sheriff, who put them up in a hotel with the understanding the two would turn themselves in to Mingo County authorities the next day. Well, that next day, Dan Christian arrived in Huntington with an investigator named Jim Clark, a trusted friend of Cap's. They escorted him back to Williamson, where Cap and Joe Glenn turned themselves in.
Cap Hatfield stood trial for the events of that election day. In the end, 11 of the jurors found him not guilty of murder, but one held out. So instead of a jury being, a hung jury, the 12 agreed to find Cap guilty of involuntary manslaughter instead. Cap was sentenced to a light term for manslaughter, and Joe, who wasn't even yet 18, was sent to reform school. Now, Cap was placed in the county jail at Williamson to serve his sentence. Not long after, Nan came to visit her husband, who told her to sell part of the land around the mouth of Mate Creek, which she did. She then visited her husband again, this time with a hand drill, which she managed to get to. A hand drill?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay.
You
got to tell me about this.
Oh, I'm going to.
Okay.
After the sale of the land to the Red Jacket Coal Company closed, and she got that $500 they paid for it, Nan brought Cap a cane basket containing a pistol, ammo, a change of clothes, and the $500 hidden inside. She then went on home until the night that Cap told her to be waiting at a certain spot on the road leading out of Williamson. Here's where we get to the drill. Day after day, Cap Hatfield used that hand drill to drill small holes in that block wall of his cell. Finally, on July 30th, 1897, he had managed to drill enough holes to weaken that wall so that he could kick it out and then wriggle out of the jail and make his way to freedom. He met up with Nan, changed his clothes, said goodbye, then headed off into the mountain to Devil Anse's house, where he got some rest and some supplies. He and his two young brothers, Troy and Elias, 15 and 17, left together, the boys returning a few days later.
Troy and Elias soon got into trouble of their own, getting into a fight with a neighbor with whom they were working a timbering job. The next morning, the neighbor, Dave Kinney, was found dead, having been shot multiple times. The boys denied any involvement, but there was another man there who said that, many said, was Cap, and before you know it, Cap was indicted on charges of killing Mr. Kinney, but the grand jury soon dropped the charges. Unfortunately for Troy and Elias, they were indicted for murder, so they both decided to take off and head west to Oklahoma. Cap decided someone needed to take care of the two boys, not to mention the fact that he needed to get out of the area too. He decided to accompany them to the Oklahoma Territory. There, he left them and headed on up to Colorado, eventually ending up in the town of Gunnison. Well, why in the world would he pick a town like Gunnison, Steve?
Well, I'll tell you. It turns out that his wife Nan had an elderly relative who lived in Gunnison. And apparently hungry for human companionship and company, Cap spun a tale about being a man from West Virginia named Leland Smith, and that she was his aunt through her late husband. He now had a new family. Well, Cap took on a job as a farmhand as Leland Smith, moving in with the family that had hired him. After a few months working on the farm, his employers called him in for a meeting. There they told him they knew who he was, Cap Hatfield. They also told him not to worry. They had no intention of ratting him out to the authorities. They had appreciated Rod his hard work on the farm and even offered to give him the farm when they died if he'd stay on and help take care of them in their old age. Well, Cap declined the generous offer and decided to return to West Virginia, a decision they say he regretted basically the rest of his life because he really liked these folks. But before he went back to West Virginia, he headed up to the Pacific Northwest to look for his older brother, Johnsy, who had also headed out and away from trouble and supposedly headed up that way to avoid the bounty hunters looking to cash in on the feud. He left Gunnison in 1898.
After an intense search, Cap found Johnsy, who had been working as a lumberjack in British Columbia, in Canada. He persuaded Johnsy to return home, although the two took different routes in getting there. Cap returned to West Virginia that was, a little less interested in putting him back in jail, probably due to his father's growing wealth and political influence. He settled down, having mellowed out west, and learned to read. Then he took up reading the law, becoming a police officer and an attorney in Logan County, with Joe Glenn also becoming a lawyer and his law partner. Wow.
How about that? You go from a life of crime to being a lawyer. Some folks would say there's no difference, but, I'm not going to comment on that.
Well, I like the thing that he mellowed out. When
Yes.
he went out there, he mellowed out west. And, they say that out west has a way of doing that to you.
Well, he met that couple and they had trust in him.
Mm-hmm.
And they offered him something that probably nobody else had offered, just out of the kindness of their hearts. So, that kind of treatment and seeing the rest of the world and getting out away from, this little area that he'd grown up in probably did him a world of good and gave him the chutzpah, I guess you'd call it, to come back and learn to read. His wife taught him how to read. Nan did. And then not only learn how to read, but read the law and become a very prominent attorney there in Logan County.
Well, and I guess there were some trust issues involved. When you get in a situation like that in the Hatfields, there's very few people, I guess, you can put your trust in because you just don't know how they're going to be or how these people are going to go, and they could tell something on you. And, even though they knew who he was, he, I guess, couldn't afford to take that chance.
Yeah. Well, folks, that's the story of Cap Hatfield's run from the law. Another bit of the history of this place we call home, Appalachia. Thanks for listening. You can subscribe to the audio version of the podcast at Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Audible, iHeartRadio, Radio Public, Stitcher, or on your favorite podcast app. Till next we meet, y'all take care. So long, everybody.
So long.